Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Between Bells. I'm Baker Machado. President Trump says we could be looking at the greatest rigged election in history in November if we see widespread voting by mail. The president continues to ramp up his attacks on mail voting plans, even threatening to withhold funding from the states of Michigan and Nevada as well. Joining us now is David Super, professor of law over at Georgetown University. Great to have you here, Professor. Thanks so much for joining us. Of course, due to the coronavirus outbreak, a lot of states are looking at mail-in voting, and it might be necessary come November. But is there any evidence to suggest that it favors one party or another?
There really isn't. There are states that have had mail voting for quite a while, like Colorado, that have elected plenty of Republicans. There's no indication that in states with mail voting, the final results differ very much from what you see in the polls one way or the other.
I'm glad you mentioned all of that because you're right. Colorado does this, Utah does this, Oregon does this, but those aren't states the president is threatening any sort of repercussions at. It's states like Michigan and Nevada in particular. What sort of harm does he do by talking about the mail-in voting process in states like that?
Well, I think he potentially scares other states off of adopting prudent mail-in voting approaches or slows those states down so that they don't take the time they need to get it right. And that could mean more people facing the horrible choice that people in Wisconsin did of risking their lives or giving up the franchise.
The president has already sort of laid the groundwork for the 2020 election, almost delegitimizing it by saying it's already rigged. Does that kind of give us a sense of what will happen after November, depending on if he wins or loses, by essentially saying that the whole process was delegitimized and rigged?
I mean, I think he's certainly setting himself up to try to resist an election that he lost and to try to encourage his supporters to threaten upheaval if he loses an election. I can't imagine that he will actually be president after noon on January 20th if he loses the election, but the threat may give him leverage to get a lot of other things he wants.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned the election and if he's in the White House. The New York Times had this incredible piece over the weekend, essentially saying that there's now focus groups looking into doomsday scenarios, saying, let's say, for instance, Bob Barr announces 2 weeks before the election, he's starting a criminal investigation into Joe Biden. Or if Joe Biden wins in November, but Trump doesn't leave the White House and there's no peaceful transition of power in place. How likely are any of those doomsday scenarios in your mind?
Some more than others. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see this attorney general start a criminal investigation at precisely the right time to hurt the president's opponent. A marked contrast from the last election when a Democratic administration hushed up a criminal investigation of Donald Trump out of concern that it could influence the election. In terms of the president losing the election but refusing to step down, I don't think that's very likely because he needs lots of people to facilitate his presidency, all of whom have sworn oaths to uphold the Constitution. I think they would honor a re-election of the president, but I don't think they would honor a coup.
Is there a potential constitutional crisis that we're heading towards come November, especially if the president doesn't play ball when it comes to a successful transition of power or any of these other sort of doomsday scenarios out there?
Certainly. The president is constantly asserting powers that he doesn't have. In that sense, those are constitutional crises. If you talk about a president staying on after losing an election, that's an extraordinarily high stakes constitutional crisis. It puts the entirety of the Constitution at stake. I hope and believe that most people would not support that. The generals and admirals are sworn to uphold the Constitution. The civil servants are sworn to uphold the Constitution. I don't think most people would want to follow him down that road.
How likely is it that we would have widespread absentee ballots across the country for the November election?
Oh, I think very likely. I mean, we're already seeing upticks in infection rates in the areas that have started to reopen. The notion that the virus will be under control in November when we're still struggling on testing and nowhere on contact tracing is unrealistic. We're going to have very unsafe voting places pretty much everywhere in the country, and that's going to call for absentee ballots or paper mail voting.
Uh, and let's say if the president delegitimizes the election, do you think that that changes the conversation of what it does? Let's just say hypothetically Joe Biden does win. Does that really ruin Joe Biden's political capital if President Trump delegitimizes the election for Joe Biden?
It depends on if people believe him, and it also depends on whether the Republican Party stays invested in Donald Trump or moves on. While he's president, while he has the ability to appoint judges they like, sign bills they pass, they're very loyal to him. Once he loses an election, I don't think the Republican Party's values will change, but I think their calculus of the best political route forward might well. I
All
don't
right,
think he'll
David.
be able to take a lot of people down with him.
All right, very interesting. David Super is a professor of law over at Georgetown University. Great to have you here, Professor. Thanks so much for joining us.